Going on, everyone? John Matrix here. Hope you're all having yourselves a wonderful day wherever you're at and whenever you're watching this. We're going to jump into the 40k universe. We've got a video here that was requested by one of my YouTube members. We're going to check out Master of Mankind. The Emperor reveals his childhood to Ra voiceover by DQVO. So links will be down below in the description as always to the original video and channel without my commentary and reaction. So please do me a favor. If you enjoy this video as we go through it, be sure to give it a like. And if you enjoy DQVO's content, be sure to give the man a sub. Anything with the Emperor, I am interested to learn more about. He is obviously, in my opinion, the Emperor of Mankind is the most interesting character in the 40k universe, just because there's so much mystery surrounding him. Who is he really? What is he really? Does he really have a plan, or is he winging it? Is everything that's going on part of his plan? Was the Horus Heresy part of his plan? Was his, wounding and almost death part of his plan? As everything that's happened to him and them feeding him, the souls of all these psychers, was this part of his plan or not? Did he really actually want to be a god or not? There's all kinds of questions. So anything that gives more insight on the Emperor of Mankind, I am all about. So let's check out this video. Again, this is Master of Mankind. The Emperor reveals his childhood to Ra voiceover by DQVO. Let's check it out. Oh, let me turn on the monitor before I start. There we go. Bam. Master of Mankind. Aaron Dumbisky Bowden. Hope I pronounced that properly.
The boy who would be king held his father's skull in his hands. He turned it slowly, running his fingertips across the contours of skinless bone. A thumb, still browned with field dirt, traced across the blunt ivory pegs of the gap-toothed death smile. He lifted his eyes to the stone shelf where the other skulls sat in silent vigil. They stared into the hut's gloomy confines, their eyes replaced by smooth stones, their faces restored with the crude artistry of clay. It was the boy's place to remake his father's face in the same way, sculpting the familiar features with wet mud and slow swipes of a flint knife, then letting the skull bake dry in the high sun. The boy thought he might use seashells for the eyes, if he could barter with the coastal traders for two that were smooth enough. He would do this soon. Such things were tradition. First, he needed answers. He turned the skull once more, circling his thumb around the ragged hole broken into the bone. He didn't need to close his eyes and meditate to know the truth. He didn't need to pray for his father's spirit to tell him what happened. He simply touched the hole in his father's head, and at once, he knew. He saw the fall of the bronze knife from behind. He saw his father fall into the mud. He saw everything that had happened leading to this moment in time. The boy who would be king arose from the floor of his family's hut and walked out into the settlement, his father's skull clutched in one hand. Mud brick huts lined both sides of the river. The wheat fields to the east were a patchwork sea of dark gold beneath the eye of the setting sun. The village was never truly quiet, even after the day's work was done.
So, from what I understand, right, I believe that I have read or various things that supposedly the emperor was born in Persia somewhere, so he is Middle Eastern in origin of some sort. So that's what I'm imagining right now, is some kind of Middle Eastern tribe of some sort during ancient times. And I'm wondering, like, is it a situation where he is literally supposed to be like the child of a king and his father was just assassinated and now he needs to go and like deal with that situation, right? Or is this like a situation where he's just some like poor kid whose father was murdered and he just has like insight because of his like psychic abilities, kind of a thing, you know? Modern day Turkey, if I was not mistaken. Xerxes probably came from the God Emperor. I mean, yeah, it does. But also, I mean, if that's the case, right? Like, if he was Persian or someplace in Turkey, right? Like, because there's also, I guess, supposedly excerpts where it's like he's also supposed to have been Alexander the Great, right? And he's played other influential characters throughout history to push mankind in certain ways. So it's just like, I don't know, it's kind of interesting. But I guess, like I was gonna say, like, how could that be? But I guess the Emperor is able to make himself look like whatever he wants to, right? So that wouldn't be that far fetched then, you know? Like I forget sometimes that the Emperor is able to mask what he looks like and or change his appearance for whatever suits his purposes. So
Families talked and laughed and fought. Dogs barked.
I don't remember if he was supposedly Beowulf. He might have been. It wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't surprise me if, you know, a lot of ancient heroic figures were actually the Emperor, you know, maybe Hercules or Achilles, you know, Odysseus, you know, I wouldn't think like Odysseus because that would be at the same time as like Achilles or something like that. But all of those kind of characters may or may not have been Jesus. Some think he was Alexander the Great. I mean, Jesus would kind of fit in a certain sense, obviously, with like certain miracles and whatnot, but it would also be because that goes against the idea of like the warrior part of him, right? Like the Emperor is a great warrior, and from what we know, obviously, of Jesus, he didn't teach violence at all. But it also could have been, you know, it's a different time period, and he was trying to teach humanity different things at that time. So, and being that he's a perpetual, that could make sense with the whole, you know, death and resurrection of Christ in the 40K context.
For attention and whined for food. Talked and laughed and fought. Dogs barked for attention and whined for food. The wind set the scrubland trees to singing, with the hiss of leaves and the creak of branches forming their eternal song. A ragged dog growled as the boy passed, yet fled yelping when he gave it no more than a glance. A carrion bird, hunchbacked and evil of eye, cried out above the village. A pack of other ragged children moved aside when he drew near, their ball game fading away and their eyes lowering. His barefooted walk took him unerringly to the home of his father's brother. The man, darkened and hardened by his years in the fields, was sat outside the mud brick hut, threading beads into a string for his youngest daughter.
You know, I was wondering, right? And maybe this is where the story is going too. But I was wondering if this was going to be kind of a Cain and Abel reference, you know, where the Emperor's father, you know, was Abel and his uncle was Cain. Cain killed his brother, you know, and so that's kind of where that story and reference came from. And you know, then the Emperor might have banished him, kind of a situation. That would have been interesting. That'd be interesting.
The boy's uncle uttered the sound that meant the boy's name. In response to this greeting, the boy held up his father's skull. Many centuries after these events, Citizens of even civilized and advanced cultures would often misunderstand exactly what a myocardial infraction was. The savage, constricting pain in the chest was due to blood no longer flowing cleanly through the heart's passages, causing harm to the myocardium tissue of the heart itself. Put simply, the core of a human being runs dry, trying to malfunction with no oxygenated lubricant. This happened to the boy's uncle when he set eyes upon the skull of his murdered brother. The boy who would be king watched with neither remorse nor any particular hostility. He looked on as his uncle slid from his crouch onto the...
That's what I figured. Michael is probably more of an allegory, and that maybe this is where the story in the 40K universe, the Cain and Abel story may have been derived from this tale, right? And kind of maybe embellished or added to, kind of a thing.
Mud, clutching at his treacherous chest. He watched as his uncle's sun-darkened features pinched closed, ugly and tight, in supreme agony, as the older man shook with the onset of convulsions. He saw the necklace slip from his uncle's grip, the necklace that was being made for his young cousin, and would now never be finished. Others came running. They shouted. They cried. They made the noises of language that spoke of panic and sorrow in a Proto-Indo-European tongue that would come to be known as an early precursor to the Hittite dialect.
Well, and I mean, that also kind of makes sense that he would be too in certain ways. I mean, I guess it would depend, right, on like when does his powers manifest? When does he start like having his foresight and vision and being able to see certain things? When does like the influx of like knowledge and things like if the Star Child theory is real, right, and he's like a fragment of an old one or a Catan or something like that, like then when does that knowledge from that past existence start coming to like manifest in him, right? And so like when would that realization come to him that he's more than a human and he's more than what he seems to be? Because like if it happens when he's a kid, it would make sense that he would be probably colder and doesn't have quite the emotion that he has. You know, it would make more sense to me. You know what I'm saying?
The boy walked away, heading back towards his family's hut. On the way, he turned to the figure.
But it also, I think, in context of the time period, also would kind of make more sense because life was just harsher back then. You know what I mean? Like, people died all the time from stuff that, like, is kind of, I don't know what the proper word is, innocuous or not as big of a deal to us nowadays. Like, diarrhea, for example. Nowadays, it's not that big of a deal for us. But like back then, that could lead to all kinds of other infections and sepsis and dehydration, and people could die from just like simple stuff like that. You know what I mean? So it could also just simply be that, you know, that's just a fact of life back then, was dealing with those things where people were just kind of colder and more harsh. You know, life was because of it.
The giant, clad in gold, who walked nearby. Nordafric war clan tattoos curled on the towering warrior's face, curling from his temples to follow the curves of his cheekbones. The serpentine ink curves white against his dark flesh ended up on his chin just beneath his mouth. "Hello, Ra," the boy said in a tongue that wouldn't be spoken on this world for many thousands of years. The language was called High Gothic by those who would come to speak it.
So that's interesting that he's using a language from the future, essentially.
"You have never shown me this memory before," Ra said. The boy stared at him. "No, I have not. This is where it all began, Ra. Here, on the banks of the Sakarya River." The boy turned his old eyes to the river itself. So much water. So much life. If I have been disappointed by the galaxy's wonders, it is only because we were fortunate enough to grow in such a cradle. There was so much.
And you know, like, just that line right there too, like, the idea that, you know, the Emperor grew up in the ancient world where there's still so much life on the planet, and then you transition to what Terra is now, where it's literally just one giant massive hive world, hive city, whatever you want to call it. Like, there might be certain trees that are kept in certain preserves, but like, there's basically no natural resources left on Terra whatsoever. Like, Earth is just basically nothing. Like, if there's not any kind of like zoo or specific preserve or reserve that has been like rebuilt since, like, yeah, like, there's nothing of that. So like, that also must be a very interesting perspective from the Emperor's point of view of like remembering what Earth was like during the ancient times and from that time period all the way up to what it is now. And you would have to question too, for me anyway, I would want to question him, is like, how would that make him feel, right? Like, seeing Earth turn from this lush gem of like life and, you know, different diversities of animals and creatures and rivers and oceans to just this ball of industrialization. Like, you know what I mean? I don't know.
To learn, Ra. So much to know. It pleases me for you to see what it once was. The boy cast a slow gaze across their surroundings, across the rows of tall crops around the village where every other man, woman, and child was ignoring them, as though they no longer existed. "This is where I spent my youth, working the soil and bringing life from the ground." The custodian inclined his head, causing the servos in his collar to purr. "I have given you my report, sire. Why do you keep me here?" "So I may illuminate you," the boy replied, speaking with a patience that bordered upon the preternatural. "You watched that man die, did you not?" Ra looked back over his shoulder where the village folk were gathered around the fallen man, weeping and comforting in a loose, unwashed herd. "I did." "That was my uncle. My father's brother." "You killed him," the custodian said without judgment. "Yes. He struck my father from behind with a piece of sharpened bronze too poorly made to even be called a knife. Men had killed one another for generations before my birth, but this was the first slaying that had resonance to me, that changed my existence. It was illuminating." He paused for a moment, following Ra's gaze back to the noisy villagers. The very first murder was also a fratricide, he said without emotion. Thousands of years before this, when men and women still owed as much to apes as to the form we know now. But it is curious to me. Brothers have always killed brothers. I wonder why that is. Some evolutionary flaw, some ingrained emotional fragility written into mankind's core, perhaps.
But it seems like, I mean, this is in the ancient times, so it seems like this would be Bronze Age era. Just have a conversation like this throughout the book. Big E just drops mad lore throughout the whole book. Definitely one I'm gonna have to read.
Ra shook his head. I have no way of knowing the emotions at hand, sire. I have no brothers. I was being rhetorical, Ra. The boy took a breath. This night was significant, not for the murder, but for the deliverance of justice. For my uncle's deed, I stopped his heart's function and forced him to die. In eras to come, this will be called the Lex Talionis, the law of retaliation. Or more simply, an eye for an eye. It is justice itself. Hundreds of human cultures throughout time will embrace it. Some will do so out of brutality, others from ideals that they believe to be fair and enlightened. But it is a precept that runs through the marrow of our species.
That's one thing as well that I love about the 40K universe with stuff about this, is how they're interweaving like real actual past things and even like real biblical things with the mystique of stuff that has context in the 40K universe, like with the Emperor, with this potential allegory to Abel and Cain, with the idea of an eye for an eye, you know, all of these things. That's just, it's so fascinating to me how they're weaving like real life things that, you know, apply to people's just real life things, and how they're interweaving it with the history in 40K. Because the idea is that obviously what we're living now is the ancient history of the 40K universe.
Ra pulled his gaze away from the weeping humans. He heard his sire's words. He knew the history and philosophy behind them. But the reason for them yet eluded him. His doubt plainly showed on his face, for the boy inclined his head in recognition. I told you that this is where it all began, the boy said. Culture, the warrior replied. Civilization. The boy's momentary silence told Ra that he had guessed wrong. We are not far removed from those beginnings, Ra, either in distance or time. You could walk to the cradle of civilization from here, where men and women made the very first city. When I leave this village, that is where I will go. That journey is coming soon. But no, that is not what I mean when I speak of beginnings. The boy turned the skull over in his hands, just as he had done in the hut before. This is where I first learned the truth behind our species. This very eve, as I held my father's skull and considered how to restore his features according to our burial rites. When I learned of his murder, it was a revelation into the heart of all of mankind. This is a world that has no need of you yet, Ra. It has no need for imperial bodyguards, for it is a world that knows nothing of emperors or warlords or conquerors, and therefore it knows nothing of unity, nothing of law. You speak of leadership, the custodian said. Not quite. Every village already had leaders. Every family had patriarchs and matriarchs. I speak of kings, givers of law, rulers of cultures, not merely those who give orders, but those whose decisions keep a civilization bound together.
Yeah, this is where he's saying that he did. Is this also kind of like an allegory? Is he basically kind of saying like this is where he kind of made like the 10 Commandments essentially and tried to make kind of like a universal law for all humanity? That's kind of what I'm getting from this, right? Is the idea of like this is where he made the decision of wanting to create law and order to guide humanity out of just this like savagery of killing each other for whatever fancy, for whatever reason, you know what I mean? Like brothers killing brothers, sons killing fathers, fathers killing sons, etc., for maybe petty things. And so he decided to come up with this rule of law to guide humanity to a better future. And I could easily see this being another kind of biblical reference to the 10 Commandments of thou shalt not kill, blah, 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 you know, all of that stuff. That's one of my favorites, right up there with Best HH, like 3 or 4.
This was the night I realized that mankind must be ruled. It could not be trusted to thrive without a master. It needed to be guided and shaped, bound by laws and set to follow the course laid by its wisest minds. Ra breathed in the humid air of a land that knew nothing of the ravages it would suffer in the centuries to come. He smelled the sweat of the workers and the minerals in the river water, feeling his blood sink at the sensation of a truly unspoiled world.
It's interesting that the visions the Emperor are able to generate are so powerful that the custodian with him is able to actually feel and smell things in these visions. It's like they're actually there. Like he's able to smell the sweat and the nature, and he's able to feel like the temperature. I don't know. I find that fascinating. It's almost like the Emperor is able to pull them through time to when he existed as a child and show him that.
He didn't admire the crudeness of a people that lacked all but the rudiments of technology, but he felt awed at the species' humble genesis. To think that the Emperor, revered above all, had risen from such beginnings. He looked the boy in the eyes, meeting that dark and knowing gaze, and spoke with a suspicion that curled the war-clan tattoos on his cheeks into a slight smile. Did this truly happen, sire? Were you really born here? The boy, who would be king, turned the skull over in his hands, his voice already distant with distraction. I shall barter with the coastal traders that come at the high moon.
I will use shells for my father's eyes.
Interesting. That was pretty dope, man. That was pretty dope. I mean, I've said this numerous times, like, stuff about the ancient world fascinates me. I love history in general, and I love learning about our past. And so, like, I don't know, just the idea of how they're intertwining the past with the Emperor and, you know, potentially allegories to biblical stories with Cain and Abel. Maybe potentially I could also see that tying into you know, the 10 Commandments, where, you know, the Emperor could have been the burning bush that spoke to Moses and tried to, you know, impart rules and laws to guide humanity. But it's obvious that at that point where, you know, his uncle killed his father, potentially over something petty, we don't really get in a reason why it happened. But I mean, you know, that was pretty commonplace, I think, back, you know, in the early times throughout history. People kill each other to survive, just for food, for water, for whatever, just for survival. And so obviously that's when he realized that humanity needed to be guided and needed to be shown what they could become. And yeah, I just love things like that. It's fascinating. I definitely am gonna have to pick this book up and read through it at some point in time, because that was awesome. I definitely would love to get into more stuff. And again, like for me, learning anything more about the Emperor, I'm all about it. Like, the Emperor, as I said at the beginning of the video, is the most fascinating character to me in the 40k universe. And I just want to learn more about him. So yeah, that was awesome. That was awesome. That was a great video. Thank you for requesting it. But yeah, that was Master of Mankind by DQVO. The links will be down below to the original video without my commentary and reaction, and to DQVO's channel. So if you enjoyed this video as much as I did, be sure to go over there and give it a like, as I did, and hit that sub button on his channel if you haven't already, if you enjoy the man's content. So yeah, thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like and a sub. It helps me and the channel grow. And yeah, we'll see you guys on the next one. Take it easy.